may be thinking, what is a Museum Jedi? Well, the Museum Jedi is a YouTube show that I started last year in 2021 to have critical discussions around the intersections of museums and social justice. We are at precarious times in our country and around the world where we're talking about injustices, and I really believe in the power of museums to do a great job in addressing some of these issues. But Jedi stands for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And in order to kind of get into this discussion, we got to really lean into 4 propositions. So proposition number 1, being comfortable with being uncomfortable. It's just hard work. It's not easy to discuss these issues. We really have to lean in and have the willingness to be vulnerable. But I kind of liken it to when we exercise our bodies and we start to tear our muscles to get them stronger, leaner, and more efficient, and we kind of get that soreness after our workout. Well, I really think that our cultural competencies are willing to construct justity frameworks that are equitable and fair are also like muscles, that we have to tear, let them heal so we can get stronger and better for the communities that we serve. Our second proposition is that inclusion is additive, it's not reductive. I really had a great lesson about that from the great James French, who's our new chairman for the Montpelier Foundation at the National Trust James Madison Montpelier Historic Site, where they finally achieved structural parity at the governance level. And the idea was that in conversations to really achieve this structural parity, there was a lot of backlash around the fact that people were being replaced, that it was really working from a scarcity mindset, that people were losing something, when really the idea is not to take power, but it is to reframe the whole situation where we're sharing power, we're sharing influence, we're giving voice to other people, we're bringing people on the margins to the center, and we're able to add people to these conversations, to these communities, so we really can achieve true inclusion that allows us to get closer to justice. My third proposition for you is an African proverb that my museum mother, Dr. Janetta Besh-Cole, taught me called Ubuntu. I am what I am because of who we all are. It is the value of interconnectedness. It is the acknowledgement of a museum ecosystem that really relies on every component, from governance to the staff, to the communities that we serve, to all of the stakeholders and supporters. All of us are part of this wonderful ecosystem. And now we have to decolonize and deconstruct that Western notion of this hierarchy of an ecosystem where someone always has to be on top, but actually give voice and create a level playing field for all the ecosystem to really actively engage equally with a spirit of fairness around museums and social justice. And if we haven't learned anything in these last 2 years surviving this pandemic, it is the actual fact that we are absolutely in relationship with one another and we rely on each other for our survival. And so we have to really understand the interconnectedness of who we are so that we can really start to look at justice in our museum institutions. My last proposition for you is that DEAI, diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion work is iterative. What do I mean by that? It's simply a false notion to treat diversity as a component, as a project that has a beginning or an end. You would not talk about your collections program that way. You would not talk about your public programs that way. You would not talk about how you administrate money or do any of your consultation work that way. This is a lens. This work is iterative. It's always evolving. We have to look at what we did, we have to assess what we've done, and we have to create alignment to the work to create true impact. And so the idea that we're going to work so hard and put all this money into DEAI work and social justice work and be done with it in a year is really the type of notion that sets you for failure from the very beginning. So we have to think about this as iterative. We have to think about this as changing the protocols and policy, constantly understanding that these are living documents. These policies are not supposed to be static and never changing and rigid. They're supposed to be flexible and always changing with the times. And as you know better, you do better, according to great Maya Angelou. So then we kind of think about this idea of the difference between equality, equity, and justice. And equality is simply everybody kind of getting the same amount of something, the same amount of a resource. Well, for some people, that's going to be fine to get $10,000 to go towards a public program. For others, it's barely going to get them started. And for a third party, it may not do anything at all. And so that is the problem with equality, that it doesn't truly acknowledge and create different accommodations for people depending on where they're coming into this work. Equity does that. It definitely talks about the idea that some people may need, and using a numerical example, $10,000 versus $20,000 versus $100,000, all to get to the same place because of where they are and the type of resources they start off with. But the idea between equality and equity that they both share is that they still have a barrier in front of them. So the third part of this graphic is justice. And if you see on the graphic, you'll see clearly that justice removes the barrier completely. And that is the goal. That is the goal, is to create a justice framework where we're deconstructing these Western constructs that have driven our work for so long and rebuilding things where we don't have these barriers at all to really disrupt the work that we say that we want to do in terms of helping us see the humanity in one another. And so when we think about these things, we have to acknowledge that history and public history and really museums as institutions are a colonial project. And we have to disrupt and decolonize our minds, our protocols, our ways of being with one another in order to do this work. And so when we talk about the Museum Jedi show, we really dig into those types of issues in our episodes. And so I want to just talk a little bit about the episodes that we've done so far. In episode 1, we did our inaugural episode with the Inclusive Museum Leader, which is a book that was co-edited by Dr. Chris Taylor and Cinnamon Catlin Legutko. Great museum icons in the field have been doing this work for quite a while, and they had the mind of putting together a stellar team of thought leaders to be able to produce this book to really engage in what inclusive museum leadership looks like. And so Chris is someone who has his academic work is in organizational development. He was the very first inclusion officer at the Minnesota Historical Society, went on to work for the state of Minnesota as an inclusion officer, and now is working in public health. And Cinnamon Catlin Legutko is someone who worked in the Abbey Museum, has really been a huge voice for decolonizing museums in the United States, and now is the head of the Illinois State Museum. And so I was really one of the lucky writers that was able to contribute to this great work. And what I wrote about was how do we lead in museums during COVID-19, looking at those intersections of the pandemic, which involved the coronavirus, also intersected with racial injustice, particularly around the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor. And really what we leaned on in that conversation was the idea of empathy, and empathy really having to come from leadership in order to be able to lead from a social justice framework for our museums in our society today. The second episode we did with two great leaders, two really good friends of mine, Dr. Robert Burt Davis, who is the president and CEO of the American Black Holocaust Museum in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which focuses on the narrative around lynching, and Dr. Tanya Matthews, who is the current president and CEO of the International African American Museum, which is set to open at the top of 2023. What was unique about these two leaders was that they started off their careers in STEM, and clearly they're leading Black museums from sort of a discipline context of humanities, but they've been doing this diversity work even in STEM work. Dr. Davis was one of the leaders in the diversity movement and the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. He's done most of his work in zoos and aquariums until he started working in the Black Museum space more recently. Dr. Matthews was someone who led the Michigan Science Center and has been doing STEM work in different capacities all through her life. They both have doctoral degrees in the STEM fields. But my point was, I thought it was so intriguing to have these two great leaders talk about how diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion and the intersections of museums and social justice really transcend disciplines. And it really goes to show how much a Western construct and how rigid this idea of disciplines even is. Especially for those of us who are telling stories on the margins, we definitely have to lean on a multidisciplinary approach to really start to tell the full truth and the full American story of the sites that we have and the museums that we are working with. Then the third episode is part of a sub-series I call We Stand on Their Shoulders, where I pick a museum icon who has been seasoned in the field for many years. And I'm happy to say that Dr. Malta Moreno Vega joined me for a conversation. Dr. Vega is an institution builder. She is a scholar activist. She is a Yoruba priestess. She is a Black Puerto Rican woman. She is so many things. All these intersections make up her identity, and she's just a powerhouse. And I just sat at her feet listening to the wonderful wisdom she had to partake around her long, storied career of museums and social justice. She started the Caribbean Cultural Center, African Diaspora Institute in Harlem back in the 70s. Before that, she actually was one of the early directors of a Museo del Barrio in Harlem. Since then, she has started, or she co-founded, the Corredor Afro, which is a beautiful gallery in Luisa, Puerto Rico, which really highlights Blackness in Puerto Rico through the lens of art and social justice. And she also has the Creative Justice Initiative, which really gets thought leaders together around how arts and social justice can continue to exist through all of these very rigid and constricted policies that we have in our country right now. So she's been a great leader, and she was just primed and ready to drop all this wisdom on us during the show. Then the final episode we have recorded is with the Center for Restorative History at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. This is a center that's led by Sion Wolde-Michael, who put together a fabulous team of scholar activists who are curators, project managers, program managers, all historians, to really assemble a center that covers anything from curatorial initiatives that allow them to go out in real time and collect from all of the protests that have been happening on the National Mall recently, to be able to cultivate great relationships with communities like the surviving family of Emmett Till, who they were putting together all these great markers that would mark the place that told the story of the horrible murder of Emmett Till through this racial injustice that had been shot up with bullets and guns up until recent times. And so they collected one of those signs, and they actually had it on display at the National Museum of American History during the summer of 2021. And it was just a great effect to really see those things, because it really allows us to understand that racial violence and anti-Blackness is not some folkloric thing that just happened during slavery and during Reconstruction, but it unfortunately is still happening today with many state-sanctioned murders that are happening in our country. They also went around and did all histories of undocumented brothers and sisters who are around and able to tell their stories of coming to this country and surviving in this country, and most importantly, contributing to this country every day. They had a very special program that they did with the Goucher College called the Goucher Prison Education Program, where Sion was a public history instructor in that program, where she taught those incarcerated individuals about public history and taught them how to curate public history projects. And so what they did was they worked with certain individuals within the Smithsonian and created internship or fellowship projects for them. So upon their release, these individuals were able to apply and gain these fellowships, and they worked in the Smithsonian for a full year able to really enact and establish and develop themselves as museum professionals, doing the great work that we do around these intersections of museums and social justice. So it's just a great center for restorative history that really leans on reparative justice as a tenet. And so one of the things that really motivates me about justice work in any space, but in particular museums and preservation and like-minded sectors, is this great quote by Dr. Cornell West. Justice is what love looks like in public. I gotta say it one more time. Justice is what love looks like in public. In light of this quote, and as we continue to consider museums as sites for social action and places of inclusion and belonging, our first question to museums is, where is the love? Where is the love that will allow us to see the humanity in one another? Let's make this a call to action. Let's center justice and love in the DNA of museums. Thank you.